that black powder was first invented by the Chinese, who used it to entertain by making beautiful light displays in the sky. Then, in the 10th century, the inevitable happened. A Chinese alchemist strapped a tube with black powder charge onto the shaft of a spear. On top of the powder charge was a small load of rocks. During a battle's opening melee, the fuse to the tube was lit and the tube would discharge its load of rocks into the enemy's ranks. Anyone within 3 to 5 feet in front of the tube would be injured or killed. These weapons were called fire lances and can be seen in ancient Chinese mosaics and drawings back to 900 AD. Of course, after its one-shot use, the soldier still had the spear to fight with. In 1271, a 17-year-old Venetian young man named Marco Polo traveled east on the Silk Road. He saw the Mongol Empire. He witnessed the Chinese Empire. He returned through India and Persia and arrived back in Europe in 1295. He then wrote a book listing all of the marvels of the East that he had witnessed. One of these marvels was the formula for the powder that made the beautiful light displays in the sky. Black powder had reached Europe. Once the formula for black powder had reached them, it didn't take the Europeans long to adapt it to weapons. The result was a hand cannon. Actually, there is evidence that hand cannons were in use in China in the 1200s and in the Middle East also. However, they didn't appear in Europe until the 1300s after Marco Polo's book. A hand cannon is simply an iron or bronze tube that is sealed on one end with a touch hole near that sealed end. A powder charge is packed into the hole with projectiles placed on top of the packed charge. When fire is applied to the touch hole, the powder is ignited and the projectiles are fired. The French word for this device is gonne, G-O-N-N-E, and in France they were called han-gonne. In some cultures' accent and time, this was transferred to the term handgun, while in other culture, accents invented the term canon. In Europe, the popularity of the cannon grew quickly because with them they could easily defeat the armor of their enemies. The size of the cannon also grew, and cannon walls became a popular place for these larger units. Also, a hooked plate was put on the barrel to absorb the recoil of the larger units, and the Harcapus was born. The size of these had grown to the point that one person could no longer carry them or operate them easily, so two-man teams were formed to carry the heavier cannon. With the barrel resting on the castle wall, one person in the back would hold up the back and concentrate on pointing the weapon, while the second's sole purpose was to apply fire to the touch hole. The big drawback for the hand cannon was accuracy. It was almost impossible to hit a specific target at any kind of range. Instead, the hand cannons were used en masse as a kind of spray and pray tactic. But it was discovered that the soldier could look down the top of the barrel and have a better chance of hitting his mark. But he could not maintain his aim because he had to look at the match in order to guide it to the touch hole. A lever with a clamp holding the slow match fixed to the side of the gun allowed the soldier to touch the match to the touch hole without looking. It also allowed them to add a wooden stock to the hand cannon that the soldier could place his cheek against, thereby steadying his vision down the barrel. This development was called the arabesque, or in French, the mousquet. We don't want it to appear that while all of these innovations in small arms were going on, that other areas of warfare were being neglected. At this time, cannons were getting larger to the point that they were put on wagon wheels so that they could be wheeled around, mostly around the castle walls. But the castle walls themselves were being redesigned. Bastions came into popularity. A bastion is a star-shaped outcropping of a wall whereby guns could set up an effective field of fire, and any enemy at the base of that wall was in jeopardy of being shot by one of the cannon's defenses. In the meantime, matchlock shooters discovered that instead of just getting convenient rocks, if they would take lead and mold that lead into a ball that precisely fitted the bore of their matchlock, they had a greatly improved accuracy. So the molded ball came into vogue. Then they discovered that there was quite a bit of difference in the propulsion qualities of the powders. So they started learning to make the powders more consistent for more accurate shots. Then they devised a means of putting blade sights on the front of the gun and a Y-shaped sight on the end where they could align the sights of that barrel more accurately. All of this bringing the gun accuracy greatly up. These same measures that worked for the small arms, it was discovered, also worked for the larger arms. The larger cannons that had been shooting big chiseled piles of stone, they learned that they could cast iron balls, the correct bore for that cannon, and fire it more accurately. If the cannons had more consistent powder, the accuracy improved. All of these things advanced the firearm technology over the years. Throughout history, every innovation is caused by war. Trying to get a little bit of an edge over your enemy, have a little bit better weapon than your enemy. In the firearms, they took a look at the trigger mechanism. On the regular matchlocks, they had a lever that you would pull up on the lever, and on the other end of this solid but bent lever was the match, and it lowered it down into the touch hole. The problem with that is holding that firearm, trying to hold it on target for so long, caused it to be shaky and reducing accuracy on the other end. And so they decided that if they had a hollow tube that they could run the slow match through, and a spring so that the rifleman would pull a trigger, the spring would cause that slow match to snap down into the touch hole a lot faster, and thereby increasing accuracy. So the next innovation in firearm technology was the snap lock. All of these innovations, they still had one problem with their firearms, and that was speed of getting it into action. Before they could get that firearm into action, they had to get a tinderbox and strike a fire in order to light that slow match. They could not walk around with a lit slow match all day. So before they could use their weapon, they had to somehow ignite the slow match. So they were looking for an ignition system that did not require a constantly burning fire. What they came up with was this ingenious design called the wheel lock. The wheel lock consisted of a steel wheel on the side of the firearm that was wound with a key. And when the trigger was pulled, this wheel would spin around rapidly, and against the wheel was a piece of flint. What it created was a shower of sparks, and the sparks would go down into a powder-primed pan that would ignite, and therefore ignite the main powder charge in the firearm, and the wheel lock was invented. And although the wheel lock was a great improvement over the match lock and the burning bit of slow match, it still had a major problem. Before you could get that firearm into action, you had to wind the wheel. It was possible to walk around with a firearm that had the wheel already wound, but that caused undue stress on the spring. So it was better if you didn't wind that wheel until you were just about ready to shoot. What they needed was an even better type of ignition system, and what was invented then is called the Snapons. These were used mainly in Germany, France, and England. Those Snapons is a Dutch word, but it consisted of a hammer that could be cocked, and in the jaws of that hammer was a piece of flint that when the trigger was pulled, the hammer went forward and the flint struck a piece of steel that, as the steel was struck, it moved back and opened a pan containing the priming powder, and it struck a spark down into that and ignited the main powder charge. But all of this could be done rather quickly without having to wind wheels or start slow matches on fire. All one had to do prior to that gun coming into action was pull back on that hammer all the way back to the full cock. While the Germans, French, and English were using the Snapons, the Spanish and the Italians had developed their own type of firing system, which is called the Miculette. The Spanish had the Patilla Miculette, and the Italians had the Romanesque Miculette. It's basically the same thing. The main difference was the Miculette, the priming pan, the cover, and the striker were all one piece. Okay. Whereas on the Snapons, the striker, when it went back, the pan cover was a different piece of metal. They were joined together on a swivel so that they functioned as one piece, but they were not cast as one piece. The Miculette had all of its springs were external, and the sears that allowed the hammer to spring forward when the trigger was pulled. The mechanism there is called a sear, and the sears of the Miculette pierced the side of the lock plate and traveled horizontally left to right, and as opposed to the Snapons and the other European firearms, that their sears traveled forward and back, rotating in a rotating manner. In fact, it's the sliding left to right sears that distinguish the Miculettes from a regular Flintlock. With the Flintlock, for a century and a half, everybody was extremely happy. It was a small and compact compared to some of the other locks that had been used. It was very reliable. It could be loaded well in advance. The only thing needed to bring it into action was cocking the hammer. It was very accurate, and they found that by adding riflings to the barrel, they could increase accuracy even more. So everything seemed really good with the Flintlock. They could make it any size. They could make a variety of sizes of rifles and pistols. They could add barrels that turned so that you would have one rifle with two shots, what they call turn barrels. Or you could have side-by-side double barrels, derringers. Seems like all itches were getting scratched with the Flintlock. In 1804, Alexander Forsyth, a Scottish Presbyterian minister and inventor, was not happy with his hunting fowler. With the Flintlock mechanism, there was a big puff of smoke and a noticeable delay between the ignition in the primer pan and the discharge of the main powder charge. And many times that puff of smoke would startle the birds and they'd fly off before the shotgun would fire. So Forsyth began experimenting on improved primer compounds. He discovered that if he took a small amount of potassium chlorate and struck it sharply with a hammer, it would flash and ignite. That flash was strong enough to ignite a firearm's main powder charge, but it did not give off a telltale puff of smoke that startled the birds. There was also very little lag between the ignition of the potassium chlorate and the powder charge, and the percussion ignition system was born. With the support of the armorers at the Tower of London, Forsyth developed what is known as the scent bottle lock. It was a metal bottle that strongly resembled the perfume bottles that women carried in their clutches. And it was mounted to the side of a lock, and the bottle was filled with small granules of potassium chlorate. This bottle was swiveled upside down, which opened a channel to a tube that would fill with the compound. The other end of the tube contained a needle-like rod. The scent bottle was turned back to its upright position, and the hammer would drop and strike the rod, which would in turn strike the potassium chloride inside the tube, igniting it, and in turn igniting the main powder charge. The shooter could then reload the barrel, rotate the scent bottle back and forth, and he would be ready to fire again. The scent bottle would hold enough of the potassium chlorate compound for approximately 25 shots. This system had less than 1% failure rate, and it was a huge improvement over the Flintlock. The disadvantages was the potassium chlorate was extremely corrosive, and it was very dangerous to keep or carry in large quantities. But besides the improvement of no initial smoke discharge and faster ignition of the main powder charge, the percussion system was not affected by rain or damp. So rain or shine, these guns would fire if you kept your powder dry. Prior to this, we've been discussing 800 years of technological advancement. From here on, things start to move quickly. Forsyth's percussion system spawns imitators and innovators alike. A gunsmith named Joseph Egg puts the primer powder into a small copper cup that must be replaced after each shot. A little less convenient than the scent bottle, but large quantities of these caps can be carried and stored safely, and the percussion cap as we've come to know it is born. A dentist named Joseph Maynard invents a system where the primer compound is put on a paper tape, and the Maynard tape system comes into being. This system is very common in Europe, but it lacks popularity in the United States because the paper tapes are susceptible to the rain. Maynard also invents a system where a brass tube is made and a plate with a hole for the primer fire is welded on one end. A powder charge is then packed into the tube and the lead projectile is placed in the open end, creating a self-contained cartridge that makes loading easier, safer, and faster. Samuel Colt invents a firearm that allows 5 shots to be loaded in advance. People on the prairies facing Indians love this robust shooting little gizmo. A Texas Ranger named Walker makes a trip to the Colt factory, and after a meeting with Samuel Colt, the revolver is redesigned to hold 6 shots of a larger .44 caliber, and the Walker Colt makes the scene. Colt cannot make the revolvers fast enough to meet the demand, and soon other manufacturers like Remington, Smith & Wesson, Star, and Adams gear up to produce their own version of Colt's 6-shooter, and soon cap and ball revolvers are everywhere. Meanwhile, other gun makers have noticed Maynard's self-contained cartridge idea and have taken it one step further. By incorporating the primer compound into the cartridge, they have the entire load in one handy package. All kinds of cartridges appear. Cartridges with the primer centered on the rear plate, cartridges with primers in the rim of the cartridges, and cartridges with pins that drive down into embedded primers. Irregardless, the self-contained cartridge has become the norm, and cap and ball and muzzle loaders are relegated to relics of the past. It might seem like we're changing topics right now, but we're not. We now need to talk about billiard balls. One of the world's most favorite games at this point is pocket billiards. For each billiard table, 15 numbered balls in a cue ball for a total of 16 balls is needed. These balls are made of ivory from elephant tusks. The problem is, for some reason, the elephants are disappearing and elephant tusks are becoming hard to find. Business moguls are hard-pressed to find a replacement material, so they start experimenting with chemically creating a material that can replace elephant ivory. One of the compounds that looks promising is a compound of cotton soaked in nitrous and cellulose. This material, when wet, can be compressed into just about any shape, and it's relatively hard when it dries. The compound doesn't hold up like ivory and eventually breaks apart during the rigors of a billiard game, but what the heck? So they set up a factory to produce this. The crater is 2 city blocks, and the explosion rattles windows 50 miles away. What they've actually invented is gun cotton, the highly explosive main ingredient for smokeless powder. They discover that gun cotton can be compressed into small particles of powder-sized propellant that burns at different rates, giving them greater control over the firing of a projectile. They also discover that this gun cotton can be compressed into flat sheets that are transparent. By putting a coating of silver nitrate on top of this compressed gun cotton, they have a perfect material for photography film. This nitrocellulose-based film stock is called celluloid, and it works really great as long as it doesn't get too hot. It'll flash and burn in an instant. To win a bet, Edward Mulbridge set up multiple cameras to capture the image of a running horse, and the motion picture was born. The telegraph had been around for decades, and Alexander Graham Bell's telephone wowed the world with its long-distance voice communication. Taking knowledge from these advances, Marconi discovered how to send and receive these messages, and later these voices, without the need for wires when he invented the radio transmitter. Further on, they learned to broadcast not only voice, but images with sound also. The trouble was, what was there to broadcast? Of course, those old movies captured forever on celluloid. So long as there is television, there will be old movies transmitted, and old movies couldn't exist if Marco Polo hadn't gone on a 24-year adventure and returned with the secret of Chinese powder. So the next person you hear talking about gun control and getting rid of guns, that person is an enemy of future. He's an enemy of human advances and advocating the stagnation of our species. Well, we wouldn't have seen Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon, or even had the chemicals to propel the rocket if we hadn't learned how to do it first with black powder.